wanted only the 31st, I think, right? The 31st verse to be read, but there weren't any hard names in that. Sorry, Ronnie. Yeah, everybody's going, yeah. Anyway, the lesson tonight is really one of just a brief history and just the understanding. The purpose really is to encourage you in a time where we live in a country where we're not happy with our rulers, and we understand the long reach of some of the negative things that have been happening from our leaders. And to let you understand, and I know it's like Misery Loves Company sometimes, or it's more like the fact that, it's been worse. I know it's hard to believe sometimes looking at our political situation, our country's situation. Righteousness exalts a nation. We certainly don't fit there. Not anymore. Not in America. I mean, we can all wave our hands and say we're number one, but it's not right. It's not true. We're struggling right now. But it's been worse. And there are several things in this context that tells us that it can get really bad. Israel, before they were just totally wiped out, and God totally said, I'm done with you, and sent the Assyrians in just to wipe them out completely, scatter them, decimate them, they got lost. I mean, you talk about the lost 10 tribes, there you are. They were just totally taken out of the way because they kept doing things that were totally contrary to God's will. But not just the people, all the way up to the top. Their kings were horrible. As a matter of fact, when you look at this, and you look at Ahab, who was a second part of this Omri dynasty that they talk about. Omri was the first king of this dynasty. And Omri was a heel. He got his position as king by killing people left and right. He went in and killed one of the guys that was his adversaries. And then he went in and killed all of the kids from the previous king. I mean, this guy was just a cutthroat, bloody murderer. Nothing better. And so one of the things we can start with by understanding where this kind of stuff comes from is very often they're raised this way. This is what Ahab saw all his life. He didn't know much different. Should have, because Israel still had individuals in that northern 10 tribes that should have been faithful to God. As a matter of fact, it's my contention that any time, and that'll overshadow everything we talk about tonight, anytime there is a national tragedy, anytime there is a church-wide tragedy, God will raise up through His providence those who can help deal with the issue. You look at the very first verse of chapter 17. This is the introduction to Elijah. And we all know where Elijah fits in the big picture of things. He was a powerful prophet. He was sent to the northern 10 tribes, and he was sent right after Ahab made king. Now, I will tell you, he came into power there as a prophet, and he had his hands full because Ahab was a horrible person. In fact, he began what, he's referenced to Jeroboam here in a minute. We'll look at that. Because Jeroboam, when they first split off from the northern 10 tribes from the two southern tribes, and Rehoboam, the knothead, Solomon's son, didn't make very wise decisions. And so off went Jeroboam with the northern 10 tribes. The first thing he did was decide, well, we can't have them going back to Jerusalem and worshiping the true God. So he set up at Dan and Bethel, north and south of that whole area, a couple of calves, so everybody come worship calves. And from then on, when you compared a king to somebody that was bad, because you was telling this king is terrible king, you said, well, he just didn't like Jeroboam. You connected Jeroboam's name, kind of like some of the folks do today with our current politicians, and they say he's a Hitler. Well, they're immediately trying to smear his name by associating with someone evil. Well, God does that and shows that is an effective way to categorize somebody when they're not pleasing Him. You're just like Jeroboam. And so therefore, that's who Ahab was. He was just like Jeroboam, except he was worse. I want you to notice in that second verse there, the 30th verse there, is that when we start talking about these kings that were horrible and they were like Jeroboam, if that's not enough of a slam, this next phrase, this is the beginning of what the kings were identified in Israel with. It says, Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Well, have no fear, it gets worse, because there was kings after Ahab, and it said of them, they did more wrong than anybody before them. It's like they were on a downhill slide, and there was no keeping or saving them. And so Ahab really does represent Not the beginning, but really the consummation of what would end up being the total destruction of Israel. And so one of the things we can do in looking at this is discover what it was that Ahab did. I mean, we know he came from Omri. We know what he saw his daddy do. And so therefore it wouldn't be a lot to expect different from him. He's in the northern 10 tribes. So they're already having trouble with their worship because they got Dan and Bethel golden calves set up there. But you'll notice in the next verse it says, and this is one of those comments that God makes by inspiration, and I swear it's funny to me. It shouldn't be, I guess, but it's kind of funny. It's like, is it not enough that you're like Jeroboam? You got to do something even worse than that. And Jimmy was laughing about that a while ago, and that's only because Linda's not here, because she'd have slapped him for it. But he said it came to pass as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam. Like, that's no big thing. No, that's a horrible thing. But even worse, he took the wife Jezebel. Now, that's why Linda would have slapped him, because Linda's a sweetheart. She's not a Jezebel, and she'd have got him straight down immediately. But it wasn't bad enough that he followed Jeroboam in all of his sin, but he had to choose for himself a companion that was a total and complete idolater. And she was a mean, wicked woman. Y'all guys appreciate your wives. You don't have a Jezebel you're married to. I met a gal named Jezebel. She waited on us in Wichita Falls. We were up there eating somewhere. I can't remember where, but she came up and said her name was Jezebel. And I said, did your mother name you? Mama named me that. She had a sense of humor. And I just kind of laughed, okay, but I didn't think it was too terribly funny. If you knew who Jezebel was, you wouldn't want to be named after her. I'd have a nickname about that time. But Jezebel goes down in the books as one of the most vile creatures in the Old Testament you talk about. And I don't want to get a whole sermon on her later, so we'll get to that later. But understand that Ahab had some options here. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of incidents where Elijah goes to Ahab and demands of him certain conduct, and he does what he's supposed to do, and he even repents, and God calls him, he says, well, let me read it. It'd be better if I just did that. Chapter 21 and verse 29, he did something terrible wrong. And notice what God says to Elijah about Ahab. This is that terrible, horrible king who married a Jezebel. See how Ahab has humbled himself before me. Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the calamity of his days in his days. In the days of his son, I will bring calamity on his house. You know, Ahab had potential. He had the option to make right choices. But let me tell you why he didn't make very many right choices. Because his, what do you call it, boys? Battle buddy. His battle buddy, the person right next to him, the one who had the greatest influence on him, or could have for good and for things great, to make him better than who he was the person who would drag him through the mire and make him anathema to God. And I know there's not a lot of you this marriageable age, but I'm going to harp on my granddaughter starting right now. You need to pick someone for your person that you're going to be with the rest of your life that is a Christian, that is solid, that will encourage you to be a better, stronger person than you can be by yourself. That's the kind of person you want to be with for eternity. And I know there's a million stories about, I married somebody that were a member of church, they baptized, and now they're a strong member. So I appreciate that. Let me just tell you in all frankness, you're an exception to the rule. You're an exception to the rule. Even companionships corrupt good morals. That's what this lady did with Ahab. Ahab had that glimmer of hope. He had the ability to repent and do right. But he didn't have much opportunity when somebody's right there in his ear always telling him to do the bad thing. Why, the whole thing with Naboth's vineyard was strictly, you could lay that right at Jezebel's feet. A couple of chapters over, I know in the bulletin I put chapter, I think 18, 19, and 21. I'd have to look to be sure. But in 21, you find the incident where this is the straw that breaks camel's back for God, I think, because that's when Jezebel comes to grips with what she's been doing all her life with Ahab and falls out of the window. The dogs eat all but her hands and feet. And so therefore, she's going to get her comeuppance because God's going to see justice brought through. But nevertheless, we find a lady here she sees her husband upset because Naboth won't surrender the heritage of his family, his vineyard, to the king, so that the king can do with it whatever he wants. And so the king pouts like a little child. And so you would expect somebody of maturity and goodness of soul to come in and tell Ahab, get up off your bed, put your big boy pants on, and be a man, and be the kind of godly person you should be. She did just the opposite. Hey, you want that vineyard? Don't you worry. I'll go out and kill this fella and I'll have it for you. Now, she didn't say those words, but basically that's what she did. When you have that kind of influence around you, you will be less than who you ought to be. Part of the reason we have issues in our government, part of the reason we have issues in church governments, part of the reason we have issues in the Lord's church today is people don't realize how important it is to have good people around you. All the great leaders, you look them up, all the great leaders put good people around them. That's why they are smart and honorable and have integrity. They got people who call them on things like that and help them on things like that. Smart people have smart people around them. It's when you start rubbing elbows with the lower class that you're going to end up falling. And so Ahab set it up that way. As a matter of fact, you'll find the next couple of verses, he set up Baal's altars to Baal. It's not bad enough that Jeroboam did it in just a couple of places. Ahab goes all over the 10 tribes and starts setting up these places to worship Baal. Jezebel's all for that. That's her god, amongst many others. And it says, Ahab, in verse 33, Ahab did more to provoke the Lord of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. That's not a terribly good legacy. I wonder sometimes how some of our presidents, even in my lifetime, will go down. I've done studies on some of the presidents in our country, and there are some rather disturbing things that some of our presidents have done. As leaders of our country, I'm not even talking about on a personal level, but as leaders of our country, here is an opportunity with a bunch of tribes up here that could have been brought back into a union with God, and they missed the opportunity. And they did so in part because they had bad people around them. As a matter of fact, I think it is no accident. It's a connective term that we find in verse 34. In his days. In whose days? Ahab's days. It is in Ahab's days. It is because of what was going on as the whole country was going. It was because of the influence that Ahab and Jezebel had as political leading figures that you have something else transpire, which is kind of interesting. Because if you look back at Joshua 6, verse 26, you find there the destruction of Jericho. We all remember the account where the children of Israel came over, marched around the city 1 time 6 days, and 7 times 7th day. Walls came down. They went in and blitzed everything, burned it all to pieces, except for what Achan took. But other than that, just totally destroyed it. And Joshua made a prediction. His prediction was anybody tries to rebuild this, they're going to lose their oldest son as they set the foundation. And when they get finished with it, when they set the gates, that's a term for when they finish it, they're going to lose their youngest son. Well, nobody to this time, we're talking hundreds of years of Israeli history, nobody messed with that. Don't think it's a coincidence that when Ahab comes into leadership with a wife like Jezebel, that people don't start thinking, we can do some stuff here. And so this guy went out, Kyle of Bethel, and he rebuilt Jericho. And when he laid the foundation, he lost his eldest son. And when he put up the gates, when he finished the city, he lost his youngest son. Now, I tell you right there that God was not happy with this man and what he was doing. But let me tell you, folks, I know we're in a trial today, we're in struggles today, but it can get worse. Not that we're hoping for that. We're hoping it changes, goes back. It can get worse, but we're not the first people who have been persecuted. There was a little incident that happened during the course of Ahab's reign where Elijah, who's called up immediately after to deal with and to be a prophet of God to this king, there was a little incident that occurred where he called out Jezebel and all her Baal prophets and said, come on out the mountain, we'll offer sacrifice, and we'll see who's God. Now, y'all probably know the incident, won't go into it too deep, but the upshot was, when they got all finished with it, the Baal worshipers couldn't get their altar lit, and God torched the entire offering that Elijah had made. I mean, from the bottom to the top to the bottom, which I know at the bottom to the top. Either way, it was the one that is the way that was just almost impossible physically to happen. And it was because God burned it all up. Now, right after that, Elijah gathered up all the prophets of Baal, took them down the river, whacked their heads off. Now, that put quite a dent in the priestly order of the Baalites, right there. Jeremiah thinking, wow, I've done a good turn for the country, goes back to the city thinking he's going to be accepted. And Jezebel is there in meeting saying, I'm going to whack his head off. So Elijah runs to the desert and says, oh, I'm by myself. And big pity party for me. And sits under a bush and decides I'm the last good Christian around. It's about that time that God comes to him and said, there are 7,000 who have bowed their knee to live. Get up, go appoint Obed-Hadad as the king, and several other things, and get Elisha, he's going to be your replacement. Things are not over. God's got a handle on everything. If you read these accounts and you put them all together and you just look at the big history of it, I don't care how bad Ahab was or how bad Jezebel was, they could not overcome the prophet Elijah and God's will. And my way of thinking, if you look at all of the actions that go on with all of the Old Testament kings, you was laughing a while ago about, hey, if you want a bad influence, just talk about any of the Israeli kings. Well, he's right. All of them horrible, okay? But you know what? God waited patiently for so long for these guys to repent and gave them multiple opportunities. And almost every now and then, like with Ahab, you'd see a glimmer of hope where he'd repent and actually realize, you know, God's in charge of this. Okay? It's been worse. But I guarantee you this, God's got a handle on it. We don't need to worry so much and be fearful like so many of our cohorts are in our culture today. Scared to death about what's coming tomorrow, what's going to happen next. We just don't need to worry about that. We need to be Christians and understand God's got a handle on things. We need to go out and do what Christians do, and that is tell other people about heaven. So no matter what happens to you here on this planet, you've got a hope of eternal life where Satan can't get through. There are no Ahabs. There are no Jezebels. Not in this new place. That's what we need to be doing. We shouldn't fear the way things are going in our culture. We shouldn't fear what's going on in this country or in this world. You can observe it. It's a neat kind of thing to study on occasion, just to look at how the cultural shifts take place. But frankly, God knows what's going on. It's His world. He owns it all. He's got control. Let's just trust Him and understand that even somebody as bad as Ahab, Jezebel, they didn't shift anything other than what God wanted to be done so that Israel would know who was God. If you're not a Christian tonight, we always offer an invitation. We offer it to you now. If you'd like to respond in any way, I want you to do so as we stand together.